Hello and welcome to this short video on the organization of the nervous system. My name is Professor Phil Newton, and what I hope you're able to do by the end of this short video is just to be able to describe the basic layout of the human nervous system. Everything that's covered in this video is unpacked and covered in more detail in subsequent videos. So in this short video, just going to give a very basic introduction to the way the nervous system is set out. Starting with this model, this is a sagittal section showing the brain, the bit under the skull, and then the spinal cord is going down to the various structures within the body and then back up again. This arrangement is then shown in this schematic here. We've got a brain and the spinal cord. Let's say I want to do something like kick a football or in some other way move my foot. There you go. You've got the foot down there on the bottom right of the slide. That voluntary movement would start out in my primary motor cortex and would be sent down the spinal cord to a particular segment of the spinal cord where the various different motor nerves would leave and travel to the muscles of my foot. They would then move my foot, and all of the sensory information about the tension in my muscles, where they've ended up in space relative to each other and so on, would go back into the spinal cord and would travel back up via the thalamus to the cortex. This same basic arrangement is then set out for all of the muscles of the body. So the muscles of the hand, the foot, and the eye are shown here. Not enough space to include all of the muscles of the body, but the same basic arrangement is true. There is a segment of the spinal cord from which motor neurons leave and sensory neurons come back in again. The higher up the spinal cord we are, the higher up the body we are in terms of the muscles and the sensory neurons that are coming back in. So the motor neurons that innervate the hand, move the hand, and the sensory information that comes back in, that come from a higher spinal cord segment than those of the foot. Some structures in the head and the face, the motor neurons and sensory neurons don't really go through the spinal cord at all. This arrangement, for the same basic arrangement of neurons leaving and entering the spinal cord, is also laid out for the autonomic nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is the system that keeps the organs functioning. It keeps the heart beating, keeps the kidneys filtering, keeps the tear duct in the eye functioning, and so on. The pathways followed by the neurons of the autonomic nervous system is often very similar to the pathways of the neurons followed by the motor and sensory systems. Again, you've got a spinal cord segment from which the neurons leave. There's often other ganglia involved, and the information then comes back into the spinal cord, normally in the same segment. Importantly, for the autonomic nervous system, there isn't really much cognitive control, conscious control over the functioning of this system. So the higher brain regions, such as the cortex, are not really involved. Simple way to think about this is you don't consciously keep your heart beating. You don't have to think about it. It just happens. There are structures within the brain, normally within the brain stem, some lower brain regions that are responsible for keeping all this functioning. There are two main divisions then of the nervous system. The central nervous system is basically just the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system is everything outside the spinal cord. So the neurons, the motor neurons, the sensory neurons that control the muscles, and the neurons of the autonomic nervous system. Text summary of the divisions of the nervous system, then central and peripheral. Brain and spinal cord is the central nervous system. Peripheral nervous system includes the motor system, the autonomic nervous system, and within those two then you've got the sensory feedback systems as well. And there's also really an entire separate nervous system that controls the function of the gut. You can see all this laid out in anatomical dissections of the nervous system. Here is one of the earliest examples of such a dissection from someone called Harriet Cole, who did or possibly did not donate their body to science. And you can see all of the neurons, all of the nerves basically laid out here. That does bring us on to a consideration of what a nerve actually is. The functional unit of the nervous system we think of most commonly is the neuron, the electrically excitable cell which fires an action potential, again covered in another video. The action potential of the electrical signal travels down the axon of a neuron. The axon can be very long in the case of the motor neurons that travel from the cortex down the spinal cord, or it can be very short in the case of interneurons within discrete regions of the brain. In any case, when we talk about nerves, as we saw on that picture of Harriet Cole, really what we're talking about is lots of axons of neurons going together. They're normally covered in myelin, which is represented by those yellow blobs there on the surface of the axon. Those are specialist cells that produce myelin, and that's what makes them white, and that's how come we can see them in those sorts of anatomical dissections. So a nerve is basically lots of axons going together. We're going to talk about the complexity of the nervous system then, just to finish. We have about 86 billion neurons in the nervous system. That number, the estimates of that number have varied over the years, but it's a reasonably common consensus at this stage that we have about 86 billion neurons. That's a lot of neurons. We also have a number of non-neuronal cells called glia. There's lots of different types of glia. This one here is called an astrocyte because of its star shape. The myelinating cells that I showed you on the previous slide, or the cartoon on the previous slide, those are oligodendrocytes or Schwann cells. Those are also glial cells. Simple thing that glial cells have in common is that they're non-neuronal, and there are about 86 billion of these. Now we have a lot of cells within the nervous system. Another functional subunit in which we think of the nervous system is the synapse. This is the connection between one or more neurons. Glial cells also play an important role at synapses. We have 86 billion neurons, 86 billion glial cells, but we have 100 trillion synapses. Obviously, this is a very rough estimate, but it's a very, very large number. These synapses, these connections between neurons and glial cells, are what gives us part of the complexity of the nervous system. That complexity comes in two basic forms. You have the spatial complexity. At any one time, there are going to be neurons in different regions of the brain firing action potentials or being hyperpolarized or talking to glial cells and so on. When different regions of the brain become more or less active, we can correlate that with certain behaviors, emotions, feelings, and actions, and so on. There's also then the temporal complexity of the nervous system. The pattern of firing of action potentials. This can then be measured in waves with lots of neurons firing together and seen in things like alpha, beta, theta waves that we measured using EEG. This temporal complexity is different to the spatial complexity of the nervous system. You've got where the neurons are firing and how they're firing, the pattern of firing. This is part of how we think the nervous system basically works. Different regions of the brain firing at different times in different patterns, all of which we'll cover in other videos. That's it for this video. The imagery references and credits here. Any questions, please do just send me an email. My email address is there. That's it, and I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.